Dedicated to the survival of American democracy in an increasingly dangerous world, this is Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney, acted as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy under President Ronald Reagan, founder and president of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., the go-to man for defense and foreign policy issues, joined by the greatest minds in the security policy business, the special forces in the war of ideas at Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney.
Welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. This is Frank Gaffney, your host and guide for what I think of as an intelligence briefing on the war for the free world. There are truly few people whose intelligence, whose courage, whose tenacity, and whose leadership has meant more to me personally, and I think in many ways to our country, than a man we're very privileged to have with us for a full hour. He is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. You have doubtless seen him on Fox or other television programs, perhaps had a chance to see his book in your bookstore, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. You may have read his writings in various publications around the country, on the internet and elsewhere. Perhaps most recently you saw him leading a very inspiring and I hope very promising effort, a declaration of the Muslim reform movement earlier this month. It is my, as I say, honor to call him a friend as well as a person with whom we are very privileged to consult from time to time. Welcome back, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Great to have you with us, sir.
It's good to be with you, Frank. Thanks for having me back. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm always delighted to talk to you, but rarely more so than in the wake of this initiative that you unveiled. And we've got a lot of things that we want to talk about with you in the course of this hour, most of which will be related to this capstone issue. But why don't we start with it, because it is much in the news thanks to your efforts, Zuhdi. Talk first of all about what Muslim reform is, as you see it, and how this document marks a milestone.
It really does. And, people who follow our work know that this has been a long time coming, but it's not something you can just do overnight, even though people have said, where have we been? But I think the first point to make is that this is a war of ideas. We have a battle against countries that are Islamist, that basically are dominated by the OIC. So our declaration is, what does victory look like? So we said, listen, there's a lot of reform that may take generations, that includes modernization of interpretation of Qur'an and other things that'll take hundreds of scholars, that may not happen in our generation. But what can happen is the building of an army of warriors for the ideas of freedom. So how do we do that? The first step in that victory would be to make a declaration of core principles that can be used as a firewall to determine which Muslims are with us for secular governance, for human rights, and for free speech, and versus those Muslims that are against us or believe in a different worldview. So our Muslim reform movement got together, rolled up our sleeves, 15 different leaders. Actually, there are over 30 that we invited that are part of this, but we were able to get 15 together in Washington. We met for 2 days. Our American Islamic Forum for Democracy convened it, but it was co-sponsored by a number of individuals that you can see that are signatories. And we said, listen, we'll figure out the details of the strategy as we do this over the next few years. But number one is we want to take some ownership of the concept of reform, in that we can't get to a modernization and a defeat of Islamism unless we reform the core ideas that inspire political Islam. And number two, we want to make a declaration of principles that we feel are that ideological firewall. So in the area of peace and counterterrorism, we said, listen, we condemn violent jihad. We condemn the concept of the Islamic State, not only ISIS, but all Islamic states. We condemn the concept of caliphism and the caliphate. And we then, into the areas of minority rights and free speech, we condemn blasphemy laws and apostasy laws. We said we don't believe that Muslims have a monopoly on heaven. We also condemn the concept that Ummah, which is the inspiration of the Islamic State and where the concept of the Muslim army comes from, we believe Ummah applies to the entire world community, rather than simply to Muslims. These are all heretical to the leaders of our faith community, if you will. However, as goalposts, if you will, for a future reform, there are many Muslims that believe in these principles, and that's why we live in America. So we've set these goalposts, if you will, and we're trying to begin the move down the field, if you will, to get Muslims there.
Zuhdi, these principles that you have enunciated, where can people find them? And talk a little bit about the people who joined you in your American Islamic Foundation for Democracy in putting this program together. You mentioned 15. Just are there any that we would recognize as visible as you have been in this space?
Yeah, we started a website. It's still in development, but it's MuslimReformMovement.org. At our website, aifdemocracy.org, you'll see the declaration. But at MuslimReformMovement.org and at Facebook, we started a large community that already has over 6,000 members at our community Facebook page of Muslim Reform Movement. We posted the declaration at change.org, and it already has thousands of signatures. We did ask our neighbors, our non-Muslim neighbors, to help us because the platforms that we have are essential to getting our voice out and having a seat at the table. And also, it's amazing that this coalition is bipartisan. We need both the left and the right. From the support we've gotten, the local, for example, here in Arizona, the Phoenix New-Times, a liberal magazine, profiled our entire rollout of what we're doing. Some of the names you may know include Ezra Namani, a liberal journalist who was a friend of Danny Pearl and has long been outspoken on what she calls the Honor Brigade of the OIC. Raheel Raza from Toronto, Selma Siddiqui from Canada, from Ottawa, Imam Usama Hassan, who's with Kuliam Foundation, Nasser Khader, who is had founded an organization called Muslim Democrats in Denmark and is now a parliamentarian with the parliament in Denmark. So there's just a broad spectrum. It includes some imams, some scholars, and activists, and intellectuals, and professionals. Arif Humayun, who is a fellow with our American Islamic Forum and a businessman in Portland, Oregon. So it's a broad spectrum of courageous individuals that have put their necks out and are standing beside each other in courage and saying that, listen, these are the principles we believe in. We're ready to argue with the Islamists. We're ready to create an army of ideologues that believe that our faith needs to come into the 21st century. And we had a preamble that we agreed on. And, listen, we understand there's a lot more details and footnotes and additions that need to come after this, but we took that declaration and marched to the mosque on Mass Avenue, which is a Saudi-owned affiliated mosque, and put it on their door, have a little video that shows them ripping it off and talking to us about the principles. We're going to mail this. Our AIFD is going to mail this to every Islamic organization in the country and ask them, are you with us or are you against us?
Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is our guest. As mentioned, he is the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He is also a now retired lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. He served with great distinction, including on Capitol Hill in the physician's office up there. Zuhdi Jasser is, I believe, still, if I'm not mistaken, on the International Religious Freedom Commission. Is that right, Zuhdi?
Yes. My term will be up in May. Since it's term limited, but I've had the opportunity to go to many countries, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and so many looking at the issues of religious freedom.
Yeah, well, and this is a real public service that you're rendering. I know it's mostly a thankless task, but monitoring religious freedom both internationally and really keeping an eye on what's happening here as well is something that you've devoted an enormous amount of time, taking you away, it must be said, from your practice as a nuclear physician. And this is, again, something that I think all of us who are hoping for reform within Islam are most appreciative of. So we're going to pause for just a second. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about something you alluded to there a moment ago, people saying to you, well, where have you been? And I'll remind people and talk with you about how we first met in connection with a film that helped explore where you personally have been and where others like you, including some that are with you in this reform movement, have been, because your stories provide an insight into what you are up against and really what we are as well. That and much more in our full hour of conversation with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser right after this.
Visit us at facebook.com/Secure Freedom with Frank Gaffney.
Over the past decade, while the American military and intelligence community have been engaged in a kinetic war overseas against a wide array of enemies aligned with the global jihadist movement, the Center for Security Policy has consistently shed light upon a dark and subversive effort that thrives nearly unopposed right here in this country, the one known by the Muslim Brotherhood as civilization jihad. In an effort to educate freedom-loving Americans about civilization jihad and how it has been waged against every facet of American civilization, the Center for Security Policy has, in 2015, begun publishing a series of monographs called the Civilization Jihad Reader Series. The first of these monographs is entitled Sharia in American Courts, and it documents how Sharia, divine Islamic law, which animates the global jihadist movement, has entered our very own court system. In this study, the Center documents how parties to litigation in American appellate courts have attempted to use Sharia to resolve 146 cases in 32 different states, potentially threatening the constitutional rights of our citizens, particularly women and children. The monograph not only highlights these cases, but the organizations here in America that are actively and successfully working to insinuate Sharia into our judiciary. Finally, it provides information on at least one antidote to this infirmity, a law that has been adopted in 8 states, one that protects our citizens against the use of foreign law and upholds our Constitution as the supreme law of the land, lest those who fight to defend our Constitution overseas do not come home to see it subordinated in a courtroom in their own home state. Learn more by reading Sharia in American Courts, which can be found on Amazon.com or the Center for Security Policy's website at www.securefreedom.org.
Hi, this is Frank Gaffney. My day job is running the Center for Security Policy, which each weeknight brings you this program. But Secure Freedom Radio is just one of the important contributions the Center makes to the common defense. We call our team the Special Forces in the War of Ideas. Like the real Special Forces, we strive to be agile, creative, and highly effective in identifying threats to our country and how they might best be countered. We can't do all this without you, though. Also, like the real Special Forces, ours need ammunition. And in the War of Ideas, ammo is money. The Center is a non-profit, tax-exempt organization. Contributions to its work are tax-deductible and an important investment in your security and freedom. Find out more about the Center for Security Policy and how you can help keep its Special Forces team in the fight by visiting securefreedom.org. Many thanks.
I'm Jared Ogden, former Navy SEAL and member of Team Military on National Geographic Channel's Ultimate Survival Alaska. I want to tell you about an issue that you probably haven't heard much about. Thousands of America's veterans are suffering from occupational and environmental exposures that they were exposed to while serving in the military. We call these the toxic wounds of war. From Agent Orange and Gulf War illness to post-9/11 burn pit exposure and heavy metals in the air, and other toxic exposures that we don't fully understand. The Sergeant Sullivan Center is a powerful voice in our nation's capital, standing watch over these forgotten wounded. These men and women can't do it alone, and they need your help today. Every dollar raised by Sergeant Sullivan Center goes to medical research, public awareness, and advocacy. You can make a tax-deductible donation today at www.sergeantsullivancenter.org. That's sgtsullivancenter.org.
This is Frank Gaffney. You're listening to AM 1260, The Answer.
You're listening to Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney from the nation's capital in Washington, D.C.
Our guest is a remarkable man, a very courageous leader within the Muslim American community, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He founded an organization called the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, a terrific organization which I encourage everyone to check out and support. He is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith, and he has been a driving force in a declaration of the Muslim reform movement, which in, I guess, an homage to Martin Luther, you posted on the door of a Wahhabi mosque in the Washington, D.C. area. It's a remarkable testament that you came away unscathed from the experience. I imagine psychologically a little the worse for wear, but physically unharmed, thank God. But Zuhdi, just to remind folks of a film that you starred in, really, Islam versus Islamists, that we had the privilege of putting together a few years back to try to address this question of if there are all these moderate Muslims out there, how come we don't hear from many of them? You are among the few that we do. And one of the things that just was unmistakable, though that film did not get shown on the public broadcasting system as it was supposed to, those who saw it, I think had a clear takeaway. It's probably in no small measure because it's terrifying to stand up against the so-called leadership of this faith community in the United States, that you're apostates and heretics and marked for death and all of that. Talk a little bit about your personal struggle in that respect, and where you think this reform movement can be of help to people like you.
Yeah, it was fascinating after 9/11. We, some of us, as I sat at home looking at who was speaking on behalf of the Muslim community, I saw the same old pathologies of the Islamist groups blaming America, talking about anti-Zionist conspiracy theories that they had and all this other nonsense. And we said, listen, terrorism is a symptom. We didn't form an organization to counter terror. We formed an organization to counter political Islam, and our mission is the separation of mosque and state.
Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is our guest. We're talking about this real menace within Islam, namely what you call political Islam. Others have called it different things: fundamentalist Islam, extremist Islam, radical Islam, Sharia. But your challenge has been to counter it, Zuhdi, and what have you confronted in that regard in the United States, to say nothing of what others have elsewhere around the world?
Yeah, so, those of us that are honest realize that our faith had not gone through the same enlightenment process and the separation of the domain of God from the domain of man, which the West went through in the American Revolution and all the revolutions in the West that marginalized the theocrats into their churches and universities and away from government. And really, we said this is the way to fight radical Islam. Radical Islam is a symptom of the theocrats that are dominating and control our communities. But there was a lot of fear because not only do the Islamists attack us directly as being nominal Muslims and fake Muslims and tools of conspiracies, but the governments from abroad are also empowering the Islamists domestically. So when you take on Islamists in America, you are also taking on the Iranian regime, you're taking on the Saudi regime and the Wahhabis, you're taking on Al-Azhar in Egypt.
The Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood, entire populist movement. And so there was some lack of motivation for many Muslims who are protected by the freedoms of America as a small minority here to do anything. But slowly the Arab awakening started to release some of that fear. The revolutions gave people some inspiration that we can push back against dictators. And then the scourge of radical Islam from ISIS has really been sort of a tipping point for American Muslims to say, listen, at least those of us that are non-Islamists, to say this is a disease we have to fix, or else our children will be forever conflicted between being Americans and being Muslim. And that conflict can only be defeated if we take ownership.
Zuhdi, can I just ask you on this point, because I think it's so central to what you're up against and frankly, criticism that you have received from people who I think actually believe there would need to be a real fundamental reform of Islam for this kind of peaceable Islam to manifest itself. When we hear sort of alluded to, people are generally not very specific about it, but we do hear people alluding to the Islamic State ideology or the Al-Qaeda ideology. What does that mean in fact? Is that a made-up program of these radicals, as some call them, or is this something that really has been enshrined in the faith to this point? The gates of, I believe it's called Ittihad, have been closed for centuries, this sort of scholarly process of reinterpreting the faith. And what you're calling for really is a almost Lutheran kind of reformation that would build something that isn't there at the moment. Is that fair?
Yes, I would agree with most of that. I think it's important to note, however, that we love our faith. So we called this Muslim reform movement. We didn't call it Islam or Islamic reform. And the reason is we have no illusion to the fact that we are not a dominant force in the leadership of our faith community. However, the reality is that we do feel that our Islam is different from their Islam, but we still feel we're adherent to the faith of God that we believe to be the message of the Prophet Muhammad. So our question as reformers is not to abandon what the Prophet did in the 7th century, but to say, what would the Prophet Muhammad do if he were alive today? And we believe that he would say that secularism and Western liberal democracy is a far preferable system than the Islamic State concept that he had led in Medina and Mecca. So the issue is how do you get to a place of reform? And we don't believe demonization of the Prophet's example is a way to do that, but rather to say that certain aspects of the Qur'an that applied to 623 AD do not apply today, and that ultimately we can separate those passages that are historical versus those that are applicable to all time. And that's sort of the weeds, if you will, of how we get there. And the bottom line is that you're right. The concept of the Islamic State is one promulgated by the current theology that abandoned and stopped reform, or ijtihad, which means the critical interpretation of Scripture in modern day. And when ijtihad stopped in the 13th century, the concepts of caliphate, the concept of the merger of societal law with Islamic law was all there. So it had not, but then again, globally, there was no example of a coherent separation of church or mosque and state for the societies to learn from and use as an example. So ultimately, what we want to do is take Islam, and Muslims especially, through the process in which we begin to say societies based on a legal system that's human. And that's why in our document it says we believe Sharia is man-made. It's not from God. And that obviously is heretical, but we believe that it's the truth because Sharia as a word is not even present in the Qur'an. Its root is present once, and that's it. So if it's such a there's a lot of laws in the Qur'an, but ultimately if Sharia is such a mandatory program of society, we don't think God forgot to include that in the Qur'an as being a mandate.
It would seem like an oversight of rather epic proportions. Sudi, well, we have to pause for one more break. When we come back, I want to talk with you a little bit about that Mohammedan tradition and how you get around some of the thornier pieces of it, shall we say, and set the stage for a real honest conversation with both Muslims and the non-Muslim world about the kinds of reforms you're seeking. That and more with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, right after this.
Visit us at facebook.com/Secure Freedom with Frank Gaffney.
America's injured and critically ill service members face incredible challenges every day of their lives. Since 2004, the Semper Fi Fund has helped thousands of service members and their families with both immediate and long-term needs. Join the Semper Fi Fund in supporting American heroes. They've given so much. Now it's our turn. Learn how your tax-deductible donation makes a real difference in their lives at semperfifund.org.
This is Frank Gaffney with the Secure Freedom Minute. 10 years ago, a group most Americans have never heard of launched a program of action they definitely don't know about. Yet, the decision by what's now called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to spend a decade making the entire world conform to Sharia blasphemy laws is having a profound impact on this country and its constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech. Team Obama has worked hard to adhere to and promote the idea that Americans should not offend Muslims. The president once declared, quote, "The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam," unquote. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton endorsed old-fashioned techniques of shaming and peer pressure to enforce this act of submission to Islamic supremacists. Recently, Attorney General Loretta Lynch signaled that she would begin using prosecutions to do the same. Expect more jihad, not less, to ensure she does. This is Frank Gaffney.
They are fathers and mothers, someone's best friend, and America's true heroes. Whether out on the front lines or here on the home front, our troops are sacrificing every day, making sure that we continue to have the freedoms that make this country great.
Hi, I'm Congressman Chris Stewart. As a former Air Force pilot, I understand that our troops and their families continue to give so much for our country. Let them know you appreciate their service. A simple thank you can go a long way.
Brought to you by the National Association of Broadcasters and this station.
Secure Freedom announces the launch of our newest initiative, the Counter Jihad campaign at counterjihad.com. We have gathered some of the foremost experts and activists to begin our fight back against those who long ago declared war on us. You can see our first 2 ads asking those who see something bad happening, like the attack in Garland, Texas, or the dozen jihadists at the Boston Marathon Killers Mosque, to say something. Join us and be a part of the Counter Jihad.
When we decided to rename this radio station, we came up with one word, one very big word, answer. That's because we know our listeners better than anybody. We know you wake up every day with an insatiable appetite for news and information. But more than that, you want to know what to make of it all. That's why we're here. Do this better than any station in town. Welcome aboard. AM 1260, The Answer.
This is Fred Fleitz with the Center for Security Policy. President Obama and Secretary Kerry have been saying that the nuclear deal with Iran will bring Iran into the community of nations and help make it a partner with whom the United States can cooperate to bring about peace and security in the Middle East. So how's this working out? How has Iran behaved since the deal was announced last July? Well, Iran has sent troops and weapons into Syria. It failed to fully cooperate with an IAEA investigation into its past nuclear weapons work. It tested ballistic missiles on 2 occasions in violation of the deal and UN Security Council resolutions. Iran also refuses to release 4 innocent Americans it is holding prisoner, arrested another U.S. citizen, as well as a green card holder. Iran also convicted Washington Post reporter Jason Rezaian, who was arrested in 2012, in October, of espionage. Is this the behavior of a nation we can trust? Is this a behavior of a partner for peace? I'm Fred Fleitz. Learn more at securefreedom.org.
Now more with Frank Gaffney.
We're back for what I consider to be an extraordinarily important conversation with a man whose courage and whose vision I think is indisputable. People question sometimes the basis upon which he is trying to reform Islam, and we want to explore that with him in this block. He is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, retired lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, a man now serving on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and by training, a nuclear medical doctor, and also, as I say, very active in this space of trying to counter the jihadists in our midst and elsewhere and save the country he loves from their predations. Zuhdi Jasser, let me be pointed about this. You mentioned earlier some aspects of Mohammed's life, the hadiths that chronicle it, the sort of DNA, I guess, if you will, of this idea that the Prophet was the perfect Muslim, which seems to govern so much of what has come down to us as, I guess, Sharia. Let me just ask, this is a man who was indisputably a very accomplished, if very brutal, warrior. This is a man who married a child bride. This is a man who seemed to have countenanced beheadings and other harsh punishments, even in some cases for petty crimes and the like. What does a reformer like you say about those aspects of the history of the faith and what you need to do going forward in light of them?
Well, thanks for asking me that, Frank, because it certainly is the elephant in the room, if you will. And, you know, the bottom line is that Muslims do not in any way worship the Prophet Muhammad. We believe he's a man who was used as a vehicle for the message of God, and the only miracle we believe the Prophet Muhammad had is the script, the Arabic script of the Qur'an. But his example, there are passages in the Qur'an in which God corrects Muhammad for errors he made. Now, ultimately, the inspiration of our moral example of how we live our life began with the Prophet's example in much of his life. So, but there's no doubt that in addition to being a messenger, he was the head of a military and also the head of state. So his acts, you can call these apologetics or whatever they may be, but ultimately, if we believe in the authenticity of the Arabic script of the Qur'an, we must also then believe in the moral character of the man that God chose to give us that script. So just as we believe in the moral character of Abraham, of Jesus, of Moses, and of the Prophet Muhammad, then Muhammad had to have been a moral human. We cannot then say that somehow we're going to reform Islam by condemning the prophets and saying that he had immorality. Now, certainly he participated in wars, and I participated in wars as an American naval officer, and my generals, my admirals said that we wanted to go kill the Taliban where we find them, and I think that's a very moral thing. So ultimately, the question is not that Islam is pacifist or not, but the question is, at the time, is there an apologetic that explains the battles that existed, the Battle of Badr, or whatever battles that are chronicled in the Quran as being justified because of the abandonment of treaties or whatever it may be? Is there an apologetic that makes sense for 623, but then we as reformists say you can't apply that from there on? We reject abrogation, for example, because abrogation is the way you reject all the other conflicting passages in the Quran to say that it's not peaceful because the last passages justified an act of war. And then, do you call Christians, infidels, when in fact God also allows us to marry them and allows us to have them be the mother of our children without conversion? The issue of a child bride, listen, the apologetic I learned, and I call it apologetic because I have no way to prove this, but the apologetic that I learned is that there were marriages that happened to prevent wars, and that ultimately he may have married her, but the question, because pedophilia is a psychiatric disorder, so the question is at what age did he consummate that marriage? And most Muslims believe that happened when she was much closer to adulthood at 17 and 18.
Though there is some tradition of it being 9 too. So I mean, I guess what
and that,
often
those
comes
are the
down
hadith
to,
that we reject.
Yeah. Well, and I guess, Sudi, and I'm good with this personally. I think many of us who very much want to see Muslims, particularly in this country, but around the world as well, practice their faith in a way that is genuinely tolerant, genuinely moral, genuinely peaceable, genuinely aligned, really, along the very principles that you've laid out in this remarkable document, your Declaration of the Muslim Reform Movement. It does seem, though, and I think to be fair, you're sort of picking and choosing the parts of the practice, the traditions, the scriptures, the stories of the faith in order to bring forward something that is all of those qualities. And again, you don't have a disagreement with me about that. It's just there are those, and certainly those in the Muslim community, I need not tell you, who consider this to be simply heretical and outrageous and probably a capital offense. So talk us through that, Sudi Jasser, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, when you say picking and choosing, the issue is, and you're exactly right that many people say that, but what they're describing as the faith of Islam is all human accounts, texts written by human beings, be it Ibn Taymiyyah or other scholars, that are central parts of the cancer that has in many ways dominated Islam, even at the moment that the Prophet died. I mean, Tariq Fatah has written books in which he talks about the program of political Islam began right at the Prophet. 3 of the first 4 caliphs were assassinated. And yet even with that, Bernard Lewis, one of the classic scholars of Islam, wrote a book about what went wrong, and that he said the golden age of Judaism, Judaic scholarship happened living under Islamic rule, but yet at the time it was the most modern civilization on the planet. And if the Prophet Muhammad himself was so dysfunctional and evil and a warrior and all these other things that are portrayed on him, how could you have had such a vibrant civilization with 4,000 different schools of thought before ijtihad actually closed down if the Prophet's example was so pathological? So I think the shortest way towards victory, which is going to be a long way, but still the shortest way, is to say that the Prophet's example, through the corruption of what is thought to be the seerah or the example of him, is actually what we need to reform, number one. Number two, the Arabic scripture of the Qur'an, which we believe to be authentic, its interpretation is what's been destroyed, and still adhere to the original script of the Qur'an.
But that does require picking and choosing passages from it, it seems to me, because while some of the surah and the hadiths and so on are clearly, as you say, man-made and perhaps thereby discountable, if the Quran represents the received word of God, there are considerable number of passages in it, as you know, that I think are very much at odds with the kinds of principles that you're espousing here. And again, I'm not in opposition to discarding them or simply not considering them to be guidance from God. It's just that's not generally regarded as Islam, is it?
Oh, and Frank, you're exactly right. I mean, we say, look, there's a passage that permits polygamy. What do we do with that? All of my Muslim friends say, listen, that applied in the 7th century, but today that's immoral. The passage on severing of the hands, the passage that says a woman gets a half of a vote of a man, all of these things we need to say, listen, we're not going to rip them out. God forbid. This is our Arabic Quran. But we're going to say, if Muhammad was alive today, he would tell us, listen, those applied to a 7th century pagan tribe that Muhammad was revealing his message to, and it does not apply for equality of men and women, for all these other principles that we need to lift up, that there was the seed of the beginning in the 7th century, but now there's such clarity that that's a much better society and principle that we need to put a circle around those passages and say they just don't apply anymore today.
Yeah. Well, again, this is what marks you as courageous, to say the least, Zuhdi Jasser. We're going to have to pause in a moment for a final break in our conversation with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. And when we pick up on the other side, I'd like to visit with you a little bit about what you're up against, Zuhdi. And as we've sort of indicated in a couple of remarks here, it's not, unfortunately, just the violent jihadists that reformers confront. It's also those who are engaged in what the Muslim Brotherhood calls civilization jihad. That is going to be a topic for our conversation with Zuhdi Jasser right after this.
Go to securefreedomradio.org today. It's your freedom. It's your country. Frank Gaffney's Secure Freedom Radio.
It's been over 7 years since a church group from another state brought a couple hundred refugees to the rural county where I live. I wanted to know, how could they do this? What was the governmental process that allowed the resettlement of refugees to a county ill-prepared to assimilate them? Employment opportunities were scarce. The health department was not familiar with illnesses and mental health problems of people who came from parts of the third world. The school system was not prepared to teach large numbers of students who didn't speak English.
That's author Ann Corcoran discussing her new book, Federal Immigration Policy, Resettlement, and the Hijra to America. She explains how Muslim immigrants are being quietly resettled into American towns without vetting them, even for terrorist links. Corcoran also explains how the global jihad movement is using immigration as a stealth campaign to spread its influence in America. You can read Federal Immigration Policy, Resettlement, and the Hijra to America on securefreedom.org or purchase a copy on Amazon.com.
Hi, this is Frank Gaffney. My day job is running the Center for Security Policy, which each weeknight brings you this program. But Secure Freedom Radio is just one of the important contributions the Center makes to the common defense. We call our team the Special Forces in the War of Ideas. Like the real Special Forces, we strive to be agile, creative, and highly effective in identifying threats to our country and how they might best be countered. We can't do all this without you, though. Also, like the real Special Forces, ours need ammunition. And in the War of Ideas, ammo is money. The center is a nonprofit, tax-exempt organization. Contributions to its work are tax-deductible and an important investment in your security and freedom. Find out more about the Center for Security Policy and how you can help keep its Special Forces team in the fight by visiting securefreedom.org. Many thanks.
I'm Robert Muse, co-founder and senior counsel of the American Freedom Law Center, our nation's premier public interest law firm fighting for your faith and freedom in courtrooms across America. Make no mistake, we live in a pivotal time. Secular progressives such as Barack Obama and his surrogates are zealously sweeping religion from the public square, foisting Sharia law and other harmful international precedents into our courts and Constitution, assaulting the traditional family, and weakening our national defense by, among other things, undermining the strength of our military through social engineering and political correctness. But I can assure you that the American Freedom Law Center is aggressively engaging our nation's enemies with offensive lawfare to defend our fundamental rights and to fight stealth jihad in all of its forms, including the civilization jihad being waged by Muslim Brotherhood front groups operating here in the U.S. Indeed, there is no other public interest law firm as uniquely qualified to fight this battle. But we need your prayers and financial support to succeed. Please consider a tax-deductible donation to support our critical fight for your faith and freedom. Visit us at www.americanfreedomlawcenter.org.
This is Fred Plight for the Center for Security Policy. Last week, the IAEA issued an important report on Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. The IAEA found that Iran continued nuclear weapons research until at least 2009 and did not halt it in 2003, as U.S. intelligence agencies previously had concluded. Iran failed to fully cooperate with the investigation and in many cases provided meaningless answers. Some of these answers were not credible. Iran also did not resolve concerns that it was conducting early preparations for a nuclear test. Obama officials previously said that Iran must resolve questions about past nuclear weapons work before sanctions can be lifted under the nuclear deal. So, will the deal be halted? Of course not. The Obama administration now says the outcome of this report doesn't matter. This is the latest indication that the nuclear deal with Iran is national security fraud. I'm Fred Plight. Learn more at securefreedom.org.
This is Ginny Thomas. I do video interviews of leaders with the Daily Caller. I had the privilege recently of interviewing Diana West about her extraordinary new book, American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character. You can see it at dailycaller.com. American Betrayal reads like a spellbinding historical thriller, but it is also a carefully documented account of how the U.S. government was penetrated by communist agents in the years after President Roosevelt normalized relations with the Soviet Union. Diana West shows how a similar assault is being mounted today by yet another collectivist ideology, the supremacist Islamic doctrine of Sharia. She establishes that while the communists and the Islamists may have very different visions of the world, they have employed the same techniques to defeat America. Please watch my conversation with Diana West about American Betrayal, then check out the other great leaders we profile at dailycaller.com.
Annie Soldier Incorporated was started in August 2003 as a simple family effort to help the soldiers in one Army unit, thus the name. However, due to overwhelming requests, on January 1, 2004, the Annie Soldier effort was expanded so it would include any member of any of the armed services in harm's way. Won't you please help? Find out how by going to www.anniesoldier.com today.
Go to securefreedomradio.org today. It's your freedom. It's your country. Frank Gaffney's Secure Freedom Radio.
This is a conversation that I personally will long revere, and I appreciate very much the time of our guest, and I hope those of you listening will remember it as well. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He has now for years, really going back to, as I recall, right after 9/11, been a champion within the American Muslim community of the kinds of principles and values and priorities that I think we all hope all Muslims would have. And yet, Zuhdi, what you've confronted in the course of your efforts to speak out for a peaceable, tolerant Islam that respects a division between the mosque and the state, reveres the Constitution of the United States, isn't trying to supplant it with Sharia. you have confronted not just the violent jihad that is much in the news these days, of course, but also a more stealthy, insidious kind of jihad within the Muslim American community. Talk a little bit about the Muslim Brotherhood and its organs and operations here and what that's meant for your efforts as well as what it means for our security.
Yeah, and I would even tell you it's not that insidious. The violent, it's sort of like confronting drunk driving. If you don't confront the alcoholism, the driving is simply the last moments, and you're not going to defeat that by simply waiting for them to grab their keys and get in the car. There is a program in which there is the intoxicant of political Islam and the supremacism that the Islamic State identity ultimately fuels. So the radicalization process, unfortunately, Frank, our society, government, media, when we focus after every one of these attacks upon the militants, they talk about radicalization, and really the whole conversation that we're talking about publicly is what I call operationalization, when they decide to put a military vest on and get weapons and start killing people. But radicalization, most of the Islamic organizations in this country are part of the radicalization process, which is a separatist movement that demonizes the West, that makes Muslims feel like they're under siege. The Council on American Islamic Relations, the Islamic Society of North America, these are Islamist groups that get their inspiration from a sense of collectivism of Muslims, that we should be a political entity, that where they're a majority, they should be an Islamic state, and thus that ultimately is how the Nidal Hassans of the world starts. They believe that ultimately their allegiance should be to the global ummah, the Muslim community, and ultimately the Muslim army. So the only way to counter this sense of wanting to die for the Islamic State is helping our youth develop the sense of rather dying for America, dying for secular liberal democracy. And, I laid out in the National Review yesterday a piece on what is our program and our strategy with this Muslim reform movement. And the bottom line is that we are inherently decentralized as anti-Islamists. So this isn't going to happen overnight. It took us years until we finally realized that many of us, be it left of center or right, were doing the same thing, and we needed to come together with a platform which this declaration gives us and unite around it, and thus use that as a way to separate who is part of that program so that there's no more debate, Frank, about who is a Muslim Brotherhood entity and who is not.
Yeah, it's again a very helpful fault line. I personally think it kind of is synonymous with the fault line of Sharia. You clearly are rejecting, as you say, this man-created doctrine or ideology. And I want to just ask you, Zudi, because this is obviously now much on the minds of a lot of Americans. We're hearing the Republican presidential candidates struggling with how to get their hands around, or their heads around, I should say, what we're confronting. A number of them have adopted, as I think it's fair to say, an improvement over countering violent extremism. But they're coming up with terms like radical Islamic terrorism. And I'm wondering if really, based on what you've just said, that there isn't something beyond terrorism that's afoot here. It's kind of pre-violent jihad that is also to be worried about, not just the violent kind, isn't it?
Well, in my piece I laid out in National Review, I said, imagine fighting the Cold War, and all we filtered were for, do you believe in the imperialist Soviet desires of their communist program? No. We asked people, are you a member of the Communist Party? We filtered in the hundreds of people studying it for even socialist ideology, let alone communist ideology, because they all gravitate around that same center of gravity, which is a collectivist mentality. So Muslim collectivists that believe in the Islamist dominance versus those Muslims that reject collectivism under political entities, or in Arabic we call Harikat Islamiyya, which are Islamic movements. So those political movements that can win elections in Tunisia, in Egypt, that would win an election in Saudi Arabia if the royal family left. The bottom line, though, is that the only difference between the royal families and these populist movements is one is a corporate Islamist structure with a board of directors of thugs, and the other is a populist movement. So we need to, if we're going to have a sense of where we're headed with a vision, that vision needs to be a third pathway to embrace the prisoners of conscience, the minorities, the Sunni reformers, the Shia reformers. That ultimately is the only program, and it really broke my heart to watch the debates and not hear any of the candidates lay out a doctrine or a vision for what they see above this sort of battle against terrorism. And we're learning today the Saudis themselves that supposedly are creating this alliance. The alliance is a sham. Half the countries didn't even know they were in it because the Saudis themselves are the sort of progenitors of this entire ISIS ideology.
Yeah. I'm told they're also creating an Islamic army to defend against enemies of the faith. That is further evidence of a problem there, I think. Zuhdi, I've got two other issues that are very important that I really would like to talk to you about quickly, and we're almost out of time. One is another of these Islamic movements, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and its war on freedom of speech, which seems to have been basically embraced or at least accommodated by the Obama administration and, frankly, to some extent, the Bush administration. If you talk a little bit about that. And then secondly, before we run out of time, if you can, you are, of course, your family from Syria. I know you've been active in trying to help the plight of the Syrian people there. Your thoughts on how we can assure that we're not bringing in the name of humanitarianism, more jihadists in trying to do something that might be helpful to people there in Syria, among elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Those are two very important issues. First, with the OIC. At the top of our website that we just threw together, it says, ideas do not have rights, human beings do. That's why you'll never see any of us reformers use the word Islamophobia. Islamophobia was created by the OIC as a concept in the 90s in order to suppress any criticism, not of Muslims, but of Islam. And that's how they choke any type of ijtihad and reform.
Their program of action, 10 years on, that's where we are. Exactly right.
Exactly. So, yes, we talk about there's some bigotry against Muslims that exists, but to call it Islamophobia is a way of making the West, supposedly the bastion of freedom, suppress any criticism of Islam, and that's what's happening from the left. As far as Syria is concerned, I think we need a task force. I said, listen, we need to pause all refugee resettlement until we have a filter for jihadism and especially for this Islamist political movement, as we did in the Cold War against communism. And that task force, once it does that, we need to embrace Muslim reformers and those who are escaping both the evil of the Assad regime and the evil of ISIS, because that narrative of what America stands for, if we shut down and say no Muslim immigration, you're actually going to abandon the war of ideas, which is the only long-term solution. But we shouldn't do that in a suicidal fashion. We need to have a task force that begins to set up, I think, our declaration as an example of how to tell which Muslims are with us and which ones are against.
It's a tremendous public service, Zuhdi Jasser, as has been both that you've rendered in uniform and in so many other regards, now in the private sector as a medical doctor in Phoenix, and as the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. I am privileged to know you and consider you a friend and to have had this very important conversation with you. I look forward to doing it so again soon. Zuhdi, in the meantime, stay well and stay safe. I hope to have a conversation with the rest of you again tomorrow. Same time, same station. Until then,